Hey, this is Helen Dawson, and you're listening to the Innovation Crowd podcast. Businesses are looking to reinvent themselves, be more digital, more sustainable, and thrive in a volatile world. Yet most corporate innovation programs don't deliver. In fact, many don't even survive after their second birthday. On this show, I sit down with the experts to discuss the strategies that work, so you don't have to learn the hard way. So come and join me in the Innovation Crowd. Welcome back to the Innovation Crowd. As usual, we have a guest to talk to us about what they think about corporate innovation or innovation in general. And I'm very excited today to have my friend Neel Arya with us. We first met in our consulting days, but he's gone on to be a leadership coach extraordinaire and work with all sorts of companies, including venture builders and startups, not just big corporates. So welcome, Neel. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning, Helen. Lovely to see you. It's a pleasure to be here. As you say, I'm a leadership coach. I'm a designer of development programs, and I also facilitate programs really to support leaders across a variety of different contexts, develop and grow in response to the challenges which you referred to in the opening to this podcast around this volatile, uncertain world that we live in.
And I think we both see that things are moving beyond just kind of growth and revenue and more into sustainability and social contracts and the whole ESG agenda. So do you see that evolving in your practice too?
Yeah, massively and across the board. I mean, I think in terms of just rhetoric, everyone talks about purpose. Everyone talks about sustainability in the environment. Everyone talks about digital. But as you scratch the surface of this, what you realize is actually people, leaders, organizations are really being pushed to their edges, pushed to the limits of what organizations are designed to achieve and what our educations have taught us about how to deal with problem solving. And so that's what makes my work absolutely fascinating, because you're working with grown-ups, very experienced grown-ups, successful grown-ups, who are having to rewire themselves to learn to think, behave, act in very different ways to what they were taught was appropriate and right.
And what do you think those new ways of behaving are then? What should we be doing more of?
Wow. I mean, how long do we have?
About half an hour, mate.
No, I mean, when you and I first spoke about this a few years ago, I had this nice little neat packaged answer that actually was about these 4 C's. And right, what we need to be curious and courageous, collaborative, compassionate. And I do think some of those things still hold. I think one of the earlier speakers on this podcast, Andrew, talked about how innovation inherently means collaboration when you were discussing ecosystems. So I think that's really, really true. But I think what we have to do is be willing to continue to look with curiosity, but be willing to almost start with this idea of a beginner's mind, right? To be like a 2 or 3-year-old, to be willing to discover. Many of your listeners, I'm sure, will be familiar with Dan Snowden's Cynefin framework, that sense-making tool.
Tell me more about that.
So in Cynefin, very, very simply, it articulates how we need to go about thinking about a problem that we're trying to solve. So we start from a point of confusion, and then a particular problem could be predictable in nature, and equally it could be unpredictable in nature. And if it is predictable, then we probably somehow have some kind of collective knowledge out there across humanity about how to solve it. And it could be simple, but you might need to bring in some consultants or experts. It might be complicated, but actually the know-how is there, and it's about putting those skills together in order to solve it. But increasingly, we find ourselves in the domain of the unpredictable. And in the unpredictable, we have to go out there. We have to learn. We have to sense. We have to use all of our senses and then figure out what works, what doesn't work. We need to understand the constraints or impose constraints. And that's a really playful way of operating. And it's not necessarily how we were taught to behave at school or university if we went to university, and certainly not in the big corporate world, although the big corporate world is trying to learn how to do that. So I think it's a really fascinating area. And what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to slow down so that eventually we can speed up. We need to create space to contemplate, to understand, to explore, to research. But of course, our world is so built up around efficiency and effectiveness and delivering performance and delivering results that somehow we have to create that space in a very noisy environment. How does that resonate with you?
I think the playful thing is really interesting because it goes against everything that people are coached to believe about work, right? And you do meet people who say work is fun, but it doesn't always look fun if they're doing it. And I think there is that chance to play. But of course, when you're a child and you're learning something, you're quite happy to make mistakes because you don't know how it's supposed to work. But admitting in business that you don't know how it's supposed to work, doing that in a way that allows you to be open and playful, but also doesn't cast you off as an incompetent, that's a bit of an art in itself as well, don't you think?
And what you're saying, it kind of links nicely to what I said before around courage, right? And I've really shifted my view around courage. So courage for me is now an indicator. If I find myself in an environment where the client or I am feeling we need to be more courageous, then my mind now goes to how safe is it, right? Because when it's safe, how much courage do you need? And so coming back to play and being free to play in those environments and the risk associated with it, a lot of my work focuses on how do you create a space where people feel safe, where people can really bring them their true selves. And often I frame it as serious play, right? We're playing, but we're doing it on serious topics. And that helps. That helps, right? Because actually it's about, I suppose, giving it credibility. You know, you're not immature, you're not incompetent, you're not taking this lightly. But it's a really, really key part of how we need to lead going forward. And of course, that means a shift in terms of our leadership, right? As leaders, to be vulnerable, to be less judgmental. And that's not easy. And like just another model here. But when we think about our vertical development, so when we're in the space of developing leaders, often a focus is on horizontal development, right? Learning new skills. You go to a workshop, perhaps you learn to communicate more effectively, perhaps you learn to think more strategically. But our vertical development is really around the degree to which we can embrace different levels of complexity. And most people in the organizations I work with probably operate in vertical development as what we might call diplomats. You know, there's something about being a teenager and learning the rules of the society and the norms, you know, playing to those, not getting cast aside. So we learn to fit in. And then as we develop and grow from there, and a lot of leadership development focuses on this, how do we impose more of ourselves? How do we bring more of our authentic leadership? But we tend to also, as we're developing beyond a diplomat, focus much more on achievement and results. And actually, for this environment that we're discussing around innovation, you know, around how that pertains to the green agenda, digital, etc., we almost need to move more into a space of redefining. So not worrying about the results so much, transcending that, and being able to hold people as they explore, as they try new things, give them that safety, give them that support in order to achieve results in areas and domains that feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable.
And there is a massive piece about feeling uncomfortable, because otherwise the company would have done it already. Someone would have done it already. If it was easy and straightforward and obvious, there wouldn't be anything there to do. So I think, by its very nature, it takes people to new places. But the interesting thing about being brave, do you see this, Neel, is that the goalposts move. So you've been courageous, you've said something surprising, unusual. But if you've done that well, other people start to say that. And what felt uncomfortable or unusual or something that our company wouldn't do, all of a sudden that's integrated a little bit. And then, being brave actually means saying something wider or further. So I think there's stepping stones of braveness. And it feels like you might be pushing one thing, but actually 6 months down the line, the goalposts moved because you were brave, because you talked in a different way, did a different thing, did something radical, did something controversial at a workshop that the attendees never blinked an eye at and just cracked on with.
You got a story to share?
I think the putting the executives in a darkened room was a bit unusual. They were uncomfortable, but they then couldn't feed off their peers when they were playing a game of true or false. They had to say what they really thought.
Wow, amazing. And of course, as senior leaders, you are in the dark a lot of the time. But it's just interesting, isn't it, with those dynamics? Just coming back to what you're saying, I think when we think back to famous explorers, pioneers, I'm not going to mention names because we all know the cliches, but they kind of go off into the bush, if you like, don't they? They hack their way through it. They find the path. And it becomes so much easier for others to follow, and then it just becomes part of the commonplace knowledge which we can access within our organizations, within society more broadly. So, there's a great responsibility and vulnerability to that. But those of us that like to go off the beaten path somehow get something from that. There's something about, maybe there's a big cliff drop behind this bush, but I'm willing to find out. I'm willing to learn. So there is a real state of mind, and I guess for your audience, the trick is, how do you hold both? Because organizations typically scaled organizations that have found product market fit, very much about optimization, aren't they? And so you've got to hold that, whilst also holding this ability now to explore, to perhaps learn new things.
And to your point about your 4 C's and the compassion, I think that really surprised me when you first said that to me. But it's so true. It's easy to get in this mindset in an organization that I'm trying to do something differently here, and everyone else is stuck in some sort of dark age. And it's not true. They've actually got, a clear agenda that is the agenda of the company to drive. It's 70, 80, 90% of what the company's doing is what they're doing. They've got targets to deliver. They're generating cash to fund the innovation part of the business that isn't delivering cash. It's entirely rational what they're doing. It's totally understandable. And you have to have a lot of compassion when you get a knockback, because they're just doing their job. And if that was your job, you'd be doing exactly the same thing. So I think there's this temptation, and I do see people talking this way as if there's a them and us to drive innovation in an organization, and you need to be separate and different and special and antagonistic. And I think you can do that and it will get you a certain way. But at some point, you need help from these people, and you need them to get on board and need them to give you access to markets and customers and resources. And so have a bit of compassion, because they're doing the main thing. They're generating the cash to pay you to do this stuff, and ignoring them or thinking they're wrong, I just don't think that's helpful, because they're not.
So will you play with me for a second?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I've got a lovely hot air balloon here.
Okay.
Right? And it's full of hot air. Right. There's a basket here. So let's get in and let's just lift up. Right. So we're going up, 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 and and we're looking down. We're looking down on all of these different organizations that your listeners might be working for. But what's the system around those organizations, or the systems, right? There's the organization where you worked. There's the competitors. There's the nascent startups. And what connects all of that together, right? This economic system, right? The political institutions, etc. And at the end of the day, someone is looking for a return or an outcome, right? Value for money in the public sector, right? The returns and the growth in the private sector. And so when you're a CEO, you're on the executive committee, that's one set of stakeholders that are really, really driving you. And there are multiple, right? But in terms of those results. And so, there's a really powerful pull towards what are you delivering this quarter and this year? And as you say, if we go back down to terra firma, people are just trying to deliver on that. They're trying to keep the organization going. And so that compassion, that kind of willingness to sort of really understand and feel empathy for what others are going through, I think it's really important as an innovation professional and a legacy organization. But also patience is really, really important. And actually, how does patience sit necessarily with the type of person, I say type very, very loosely, but who wants to innovate? Because technically you might have a vision for something different. You might want to break rules. You might want to be free. You might want to be more experimentational in terms of your mindset. And certainly you'll want to see change happen in some way. And you can make change happen, but it takes time in a big organization. And you and I have spoken a lot about the Moesta forces model in the past. And, it's this balancing, isn't it, between actually people feeling the frustration of the status quo, having a defined enough solution for them to be pulled towards it, but all the while you're wrestling between the switching cost of what you already do or what you might lose and the emotions that you feel. And so coming back to compassion, one of the things that I see shifting in organizations, at least weak signals that it's shifting, is the need to bring more emotional dialogue, more emotional intelligence into organizations, because for most of our lives, there's been no space for emotion. And, we read the stories over the last couple of weeks of Google laying off a number of people by email, so there's still some ways to go, it seems. But I think that because we're being pushed to our very limits, having to wrestle with the problems that now face humanity, leaders need to develop a much deeper self-awareness around their emotions and also be able to hold those around them emotionally. And I think the best have always done that, but I think that becomes more and more prominent.
Because I think there is a myth that if you're smart enough or design or engineer it well enough, it will work. And that's simply not true. I mean, the odds are stacked against you. Maybe a fraction of a percent of ideas actually could be something financially viable. if you're in a big business, that hurdle's really high because you want something new that's like the size of a new business unit. It's massive. And the reality is things are not going to work. They don't work all the time in the existing business, but people kind of don't have the same fear of that, I don't think. And the other thing to say is that timing is important and it's not in your control.
No.
And you see that with lots of startups that were too early and ran out of money. And then 5-10 years later, that change that they were banking on, some essential component got cheaper, or something changed in the market, or a commodity price changed and everything made sense. It's timing, and you're not in control of that. And you can have weak signals about those things, but you can't know that on X date this is going to happen.
No, absolutely. And it's that sheer kind of serendipity, I think, that we really struggle to wrestle with. And you can come away looking like an absolute genius, can't you, if you get the timing right, and if there is that market fit to whatever proposition you're trying to offer. But what we're dealing with is inherently complex. It's organic, it's changing. And you used to work for Shell, right? And Shell's very famous for its scenario planning. And the story that I always hear told is around how that was incredibly powerful for the organization back in the 70s and the oil price. But that doesn't mean that it's made them, effective in all scenarios henceforth. And so there's something here, in fact, this just triggers a thought for me, which is that also in a lot of the in the marketing that you might read about innovation, what continues to surprise me is how you will hear about an organization positioned as an exemplar. They've really cracked this. This is what they're doing. And I'm very lucky in that I get to go into a variety of organizations, right? Startups, innovation consultancies, like, established big corporate as well as public sector organizations. And what you find is that that's not the truth in the organization. There are often pockets or case studies of innovation brilliance, but they're exactly that. They're pockets at a point in time. And so I think that the business press and the business schools, being a little bit edgy here, obviously benefit from these proof points, but they're not absolute. That's why when we were talking about this very podcast, it's like, what do organizations get wrong about innovation? I just feel like there is no truth. There is only trying to do the right things and accepting the inherent kind of probabilities around success and failure, maybe trying to get a little edge there by doing the right things. But that's what we've got to do, because a lot of it's out of our control. You make your own luck, I guess.
Yeah, I think you do. And I think you can increase your luck. I think you can increase the probability of luck, because I think there is this piece about how do you bring in diverse set of input? How do you learn what other people know? How do you bring that into the mix, whether that's inside or outside? And I think that improves your luck. I think being able to navigate the organization improves your luck. And the reason it does is because people in big organizations don't really know how they work. And so figuring that out can give you a massive advantage. And actually, some of the really successful leaders know how to do it politically, diplomatically, as you say, but don't necessarily know how to do it practically. So I think there's a lot you can do to increase your odds, but it starts with probably that situational awareness piece of what's going on here and why, from an emotional human perspective, not really a kind of market perspective. Although the strategy bit's important, but people know it's important and they crack on with that pretty well, I think.
So, Helen, I've got a question for you. And this podcast focuses on innovation. And part of me feels like actually the argument that's put forward for why we must innovate is because otherwise organizations, corporate organizations, will cease to exist. And I'm just curious, like, does it actually matter if they don't exist? Right? Would a smart investor not divest once they see that actually the returns they're looking for are no longer going to continue? Is innovation as a discipline in some ways just a way of consulting firms and business schools kind of just selling something that people have to tell the right story about and deliver, rather than an absolute necessity? What do you reckon?
Only very few businesses survive at the top of the stock market over the long term. So the evidence says that decline comes for most businesses, but not all. Why do I think it's important? I think it's really important now because big companies actually have deep pockets, and the world has challenges that need solving, and capitalism is a way of doing that. And so I think I want those big companies to be more innovative, to disrupt themselves, to deliver on things like sustainability and actually social good as well, because I think there's money there that is being wasted from my perspective. I think those innovation dollars are being wasted. And I think there could be so much more impact on the world if only they were spent better.
So really you're on a crusade then to make the world a better place and less wasteful of financial resources.
Yeah, I think to do better. And I think companies can do better on ESG. I think that chase of shareholder value without looking at societal value is only going to get you so far.
So I absolutely agree that this broader concept of value is fundamental. And people have been talking about that for decades. And there's still a way to go. But at its core, when we were in our hot air balloon looking down, you start to see that there are these really powerful forces that are driving the outcomes, or the actions at least, and informing the outcomes of the different players. And I think that maybe that's where some of the innovation needs to happen on that systemic scale, right? In order to meet the needs of the planet, to recognize the gross inequality that exists in the developed and the developing worlds. And so really kind of trying to live that donut idea, right, from Kate Raworth. And so how do we flex that? How do we innovate around politics and political institutions, intergovernmental institutions, the economic fabric upon what a lot of these organizations are based? Are we putting too much responsibility on corporations and the existing organizational constructs?
And the reality of invention is most of the world's inventions have been paid for with government money, but they've been commercialized by corporations. So I think your point about should governments be influencing this, they absolutely do already. Could they do more? Absolutely. Because also, if you look at shifts in regulation and policy, they also cause companies to innovate, or they cause disruptions to happen or not happen. So I think it's a myth that a company is in charge of their own destiny and that they don't have to consider these external forces, because I think it's the external forces actually make the opportunity.
Mm.
So
Mm.
you know, finance background, you and I have written loads of business cases in our early career, and that there's a myth in those business cases that you're comparing it with do nothing, and you assume the business is going to be great carrying on, or it's going to stay the same for 15 years out into the future. Almost certainly not correct. We don't invest enough time into thinking about what that base case is of things changing or why it might change. And I think that's why the scenario planning is powerful as a tool. And at a macro level, I think companies are good at it. But I think filtering that down to what it means at that lower, more practical level is where it's hard.
Mm. And it's interesting, just in terms of the flow of our conversation, you know, there are so many aspects here which we might hold as being static conceptually or in terms of their form. And of course, the reality of the complexity of our world is that these are all fluid. And how do we help people to really embrace the fluidity of things? Perhaps there's a dimension here around thinking about a broader array of possibilities and being able to hold them at once, right? And that's not what we're taught, and it's not how organizations necessarily think. And so there's this opportunity here for us. I mean, for me as a leadership development professional, really to work with people to open up their divergent thinking. And by that, I don't just mean ideation, but I mean just multiple ways of looking at things and holding them, but holding them lightly, recognizing that they're shifting and evolving all at the same time. But as you say that, you realize this modality that we got into of running really hard and delivering results doesn't afford a lot of space for that.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing for people to remember if they've got an innovation hat on, that they have the luxury of having that perspective. And so the temptation is to dash into action. And I'm not saying that's wrong. Find quick wins. I'm not saying they're wrong. But often you get busy and you lose sight of, here's some things I could and should be doing. And I think whenever we give people the opportunity to take some time out to think, that's a real luxury. That's a luxury that you can give a sprinkle of to everybody in your organisation. So it's super interesting. I remember doing a workshop, and one of the activities was people had 20 minutes to sit and read. And we gave them a whole load of material about futures and digital technologies. And they could just pick up whatever they wanted and sit in silence and read it. Also, the weirdest thing that anyone gets to do in their workday, because they're just not used to doing that. But also, it was a real, inspiration for people. Right. And all that material's out there already.
Yeah.
But how often do people and businesses get a chance to have a little think on their own?
Yeah. And I love that, right? Because what you're describing there, for me, the meaning I make of that is like you're almost this curator. Yeah. You're a creator of useful insights and data, and you're creating a space there for them to be able to really contemplate that material. And I suppose that's a lot of what we as leadership development practitioners are also trying to do, is just help people pause, smell the roses, but doing that in a thoughtful way that really provokes those shifts in terms of mentality and developing those skills and behaviors that are needed. But there's a thought that was triggered for me also, just thinking about organizations. And, when you're looking to develop your most senior leaders, there seems to be a blueprint that organizations have probably very, very slightly shifted over the years. And there's a tool that's often used in selection and development called Hogan. And in Hogan, we look at people's strengths, we look at their derailers, we look at their motivations, values, and preferences. But when we're looking at strengths, the sort of archetype for a senior executive, someone who's got what we call high adjustment, so they're resilient, they're kind of unflappable, they have high ambitions, so a very strong directedness and drive, perhaps towards something more visionary. Organizations are sociable, right? They're people-based predominantly today anyway, so high sociability, and then high prudence. And this prudence piece is super interesting, right? Because that's really about being dependable, organized, structured in your approach. And what you probably notice in those four, and there are four of 7 different strengths, but if you're a startup founder, you might not want all of those qualities in as described there. You might want something different, and so perhaps you want low prudence rather than high prudence, because you want flexibility. You want someone that can basically wrestle with the ambiguity. And the inherent tension now is, on one level, we're saying we want low prudence, flexibility, pivot, be agile, go out there and understand what's needed in an entrepreneurial way. On the other side, we're still saying at the top of organizations that we want that high prudence. And so super interesting when you look in organizations and when you're being asked in a large organization to drive innovation, in a nutshell, that starts to represent some of the tension there. What do you make of that?
I think that actually people should look at who they surround themselves with. Because I think what you need is someone to give you an alternative point of view. And whether or not you take that on board or decide to do anything with it, that's up to you. But I think people in organizations don't realize that they're not being told stuff. It's not being presented to them. I think organizations self-edit. They self-edit what they work on, and they self-edit what they tell people. So actually the choices that some of these leaders get because of this prudence thing is actually a limited set of the choices that they could have had. So I think there's a real interesting thing around surrounding yourself with people that are not like you, or that are prepared to say what they think. And I always liked, some of my teams were like full of opinion, and it's great because you're just like, well, actually, I don't know what I think about that. And now I'm having a rethink. Now they've said something, but that's an environment you're making as a leader. And the hierarchical structures of organizations actually mean that if you are promoting everybody that's going to be the next CEO, then to your model, you've only got one type of person. So how do you get diverse opinion? How do you get people to tell you things you don't want to hear? And how do you react well when someone tells you something you don't want to hear? Because actually that's to the earliest point we were talking about safety. If you react badly when someone gives you bad news, you're less likely to hear bad news. Doesn't stop it happening.
That's it, isn't it? And so we have a lot of work to do on ourselves. Right. And to be more inclusive, to hold that plurality of different perspectives, to enable people to really experiment, to learn, to challenge the status quo, and to hear that as something beneficial rather than a threat. Right.
And we all have it in us, though. That's the thing. We all have it in us. And we actually, if I look at most of the leaders I work with, they do all of these things some of the time. But are they doing it in the moments that count? Are they doing it consistently? But they're actually traits that they all have. Even the hardest boiled leader has some compassion in there. It's just hidden some of the time.
I'm now going to see all my clients as eggs.
But
How hard-boiled are they?
But people do come to me privately and go, there's something wrong with my program, but I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah.
But they're not projecting that inside their own organisations.
No. And that's the thing, isn't it? Actually, if we can create the safety to have that dialogue, that invitation for others to help, how different might things be?
I think that's a good point to end. Although I will ask you the question, Neel, that I ask everybody, which is, what's something that you learnt the hard way that you wish someone had just tapped you on the shoulder and told you earlier?
So, interesting question. I think that I like to learn things the hard way. It's how I'm wired. So the thing that I wish someone had told me earlier is to embrace that, because can be a very, very painful way of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And to recognize that actually, once you've got the data that you need from that learning, then move on. So know when to let go of the experiment, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bit.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neel. We could talk all day, but we don't have time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Helen. It's been great being here.
Thanks for listening to The Innovation Crowd. Subscribe on your favourite podcasting service so you don't miss a thing. And I'll see you next time.